Yes.
Good morning, and
Do you need to?
no, I don't need the PowerPoint. I'm just going to talk it. Good morning, and thank you, Senators Lieu and Block, for inviting me to speak today about equity, access, and success in higher education. I'm Estela Ben-Simon. I am a professor of higher education at the University of Southern California, Rossier School of Education, and I also co-direct the Center for Urban Education. And because it's relevant to the topic today, I want to just say briefly why I founded the Center for Urban Education in the year 2000, almost 15 years ago. At the time, in 1999, institutions of higher education, particularly here in California, would celebrate the great diversity of their student body. They would point out with pride how much access they were providing to African Americans, to Latinos, and to other groups. However, there was no talk or goals related to achieving equity in outcomes for those diverse students. So that was one of my concerns. It wasn't enough to provide access, but we also needed to make sure that diversity was being translated into equity in outcomes. My second concern that led to the founding of the center is that at that time, higher education throughout the country was talking about the importance of accountability metrics as well as assessment. However, equity was never included as a metric of accountability or a metric of quality or a metric of institutional effectiveness. So I'm here to talk about why is it that we must incorporate equity intentionally into accountability and performance systems. So I'm going to, you have my statement, and I provide two arguments for why equity is important. The first argument, I go back to 1964. In July, we're going to commemorate 50 years of the Civil Rights Act. And the reason why I bring it into the discussion is because the Civil Rights Act is one of the best examples that we have in our country of the use of policy to repair the ills that were subjected to African American populations since the Civil War. The Civil Rights Act would have not been possible had two presidents, John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, been willing to speak about race and racism openly. And that is also one of the reasons why we cannot leave equity up to chance. We do have to name it. When President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act and he subsequently gave a famous speech at Howard University, one of the things that he said, the purpose of this act is to achieve equality, not just in theory, but equality in fact and in results. Clearly, we have not achieved that. We have not achieved equality in results. The second argument, since sometimes equity makes people uncomfortable because part of our culture in the United States is a bootstrap theory, so that we give equal opportunity, but it is up to people to achieve equity in results. So the second argument is more of an economic argument. And in my presentation, I cite the work of Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize winner in economics, who has written persuasively about inequality and how it essentially affects our economic status, because essentially inequality, it drives away growth. In order to have a healthy society economically, and this is particularly true for California, we have to have a strong middle class. And a strong middle class has, with purchasing power, to produce the tax receipts that Landy mentioned. In California, we cannot achieve a healthy middle class unless more Latinos go to college and graduate from college and are able to attain the kinds of jobs that we need to maintain that middle class. With that said, then, what I would like to move on to is that we have mentioned the master plan, And the master plan in 1960 certainly provided access to higher education. But if you look at my presentation on page 5, you will see that our population in 1960 was 16 million people, half of what we have today, less than half of what we have today. And 83% of the population was white. Only 9% was Latino. Move fast forward 14 years later on page 6 of my presentation, and you can see that the population has changed dramatically. Whites are less than half of what they were in 1960, 40%, and Latinos are 38% of our population. So given this demographics, we need to have a performance and accountability system that is aligned with our population of 2014, not with our population of 1960. On page 7, because the term equity is obviously a complex term, and it probably means lots of different things to different people, I provide 3 definitions, and I am recommending that in thinking about performance measures, we have to think about measures that look at equity in access, measures that look at equity in outcomes, and measures that look at equity in excellence. And by what I mean by that is, we need to look at access to higher education for Latinos, African Americans, and others based on their size of their high school population. The WICHE, in their report, Knocking at the College Door, predicts that, calculates that about 47% of Latinos will make up 47% of the high school graduates in 2015-16. Equity in access would mean that what we should strive for is that at least 40% of the student population in the UC system that is Latino. That would be equity. But right now, Latinos make up only 20% of the UC system. In fact, Latinos, given their high school size, are underrepresented in every segment of the system, including community colleges, despite their high concentration in the community colleges. So I'm defining equity as proportional representation based on the population, not in comparison to other racial or ethnic groups. I included excellence, and the reason why I included excellence is because often when we speak about equity and minority groups, we tend to think about them in terms of survival. It is important for more Latinos to go into the STEM fields, the high-value degrees, the high-paying degrees. And that's why we also need to monitor what their participation is in those programs. So let me go on now to what I'd like to comment on is the sustainability plan that the governor proposes, and specifically the measures that are included for the UC and the CSU system. And even though the move towards having measures is a positive one, we are concerned at the Center for Urban Education that the measures that are being proposed do not include equity. And let me just briefly say why they do not include equity there. First of all, the proposed measures are that the UC and the CSU system report measures for graduation and enrollment, but they are not, there is no specificity about disaggregating them by race and ethnicity. And to give you an example why it is a problem not to require that they be disaggregated by race and ethnicity, under the governor's performance measure, if we look at the UC system and we just looked at the 4-year graduation rate, we would see that it has a 59% 4-year graduation rate. But when you break that down by race and ethnicity, the percent for African Americans, that 59% goes down to 40%. And for Latinos, it goes down to 46%. Right now, we will not see those disparities if we adopted performance measures that are not disaggregated by race and ethnicity. The second problem with the performance measures is that there is no requirement for setting improvement targets. If we have no improvement targets, then we run the risk of continuing the steady state in terms of the enrollment, for instance, of Latinos and African Americans in the UC system, which has changed very little over the last 10 years. The third problem with the performance measures is that they are not linked to any kind of incentive funding. And by not being linked to incentive funding, I think that it makes it much more difficult to achieve the goals delineated in SB 195. If my time is up, tell me, okay? Because I'll go on. But I'm almost done. Right. The other problem with the performance measures is that they only address the UC and the CSU system, and the community colleges are left out. Even though the community colleges now have the the success scorecard, as well as the equity plans, we see that as a problem. We believe that both the scorecard and the equity plans need to be integrated into one system. A problem also with the community college scorecard is that it's a reporting mechanism. Goals do not have to be set from year to year. You asked earlier about what other states are doing. And one of the things that, and I'm going to mention Pennsylvania here, is that in order to be mindful of the different missions of the different campuses, in addition to having mandatory goals, Pennsylvania also has optional goals that the campuses select to align with their own strategic plans. And that is a more innovative way of doing it. It also ensures greater buy-in. The last concern that we have is, and if you look at page 11, I have that data and metrics are akin to a thermometer. They show the temperature, but just as a thermometer cannot change the temperature, data are not self-acting. And no matter how big of a reporting system we have, no matter how many metrics we have, if we do not have the structure for institutions of higher education to use the data not only to improve the performance of their students, but also to study their own practices, a data system will not necessarily make a difference in the outcomes for students. One last point that I want to make is that when we talk about accountability, we need to differentiate between bureaucratic accountability and professional accountability. You asked earlier, is money the only incentive to bring about change? It's not. In our work with Pennsylvania, with Wisconsin, faculty members are willing to get their hands dirty in data and to look at their own practices if provided with a structure and tools to do that. Right now here in California, we do not have that. What we have is data. We need to move on to the next stage to be able to incentivize professional accountability as well at the campus levels. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Shulak, talk about money. Cost.
Thank you. My name is Nancy Shulak. I direct the Institute for Higher Education Leadership and Policy at Sacramento State. Senator Liu, Senator Block, and members, thank you so much for inviting me. I have a handout that is 4 pages that you have, and I'm going to not cover all of it, but you'll have it for reference. I'm really pleased that you're having and that you invited me to join this hearing that's looking at accountability framed around public needs. I think, Senator Liu, earlier when you voiced some of your frustrations, I think that where they may be coming from is in the past we've talked about accountability in terms of individual institutions and segments of higher education. That's really at the core, as I see it, of the difference between the master plan that we've talked about being old and from another era, and the public agenda that you're talking about, where you really start with what does the public need and how are we going to get there from either the institutions as we now have them or some outside the box kinds of differences. And I wasn't going to mention this because the timing is a little bit off, but our institute is going to be releasing a model public agenda for consideration in just a couple of weeks that really looks at the state regions, as Lundy was talking about, all of the difference in the regions, and asks for target setting at a regional level and other things as well. So I wanted to just kind of alert you that will be coming and hopefully provide some out-of-the-box thinking. So I've been asked to talk about costs, affordability, and efficiency, and I'm going to hit some highlights here, focusing on what we know and what we don't know, and especially what we would need to know to really engage in more informed fiscal policymaking. And just the first chart here, just to give you context, that you've heard about the heavy lift that we're going to have to take on in order to meet these needs for more degrees and certificates. And if you just see the distribution of our enrollments, it's really going to be, Landy was talking about what regions it would have to come from, but in terms of the institutions, we're looking at the community colleges and the CSU to really providing the numbers. That's where our students are. So turning to the first topic of costs, if you look at state appropriations, California compared to other states doesn't do badly. We're really above average on a number of measures that I have there, although turning to the next page, the share of the general fund being devoted to higher education has steadily declined. Right. I want to call your attention to this first graph because we rank almost at the bottom, 47th in total revenues per full-time equivalent student. And the reason is that even though this is a stacked bar graph, so the darker column is state appropriations per FTE in California compared to the national average. So as I mentioned, we're above the national average there. But when you add tuition revenues, we fall well below the national average sum of the two, putting us in 47th place. And that might be surprising or counterintuitive since we've heard so much about what has actually happened with tuition increases, which are real. I'm going to get to that in a minute. But the explanation lies in the fact, as I showed you on the first page, 70% of our enrollment is in the community colleges, where we have the lowest tuition in the land, but more than that, we have a fee waiver policy under which half of the students pay no tuition and 60% of the credits are taken without any tuition. So the general fund appropriation hasn't risen above the level of the national averages to compensate for those policies. And so we have overall an under-resourced system of post-secondary education. The other topic on spending I wanted to bring up is a wide variation in spending per student across our three segments. And it happens to be the biggest variation nationally. If you look nationally at what states spend per student at their research universities compared to their two-year colleges, we have the widest gap there. So the bottom of this page is just highlighting some figures that Landy mentioned that we really are not doing well nationally. We're nowhere near being a top 10 state in our educational attainment levels. Turning to page 3, now I'm getting at what we don't know that we really would be ideal to know if we were going to have better informed fiscal planning. We don't know what quality education costs. So I presented information on spending. We're kind of left in the situation of equating what we spend is what it costs. What it costs is what we spend, and the way that the budgeting works, higher education kind of gets what's available, so we decide that that's what it costs, and then we allocate it out. We don't know whether the differences in spending in the three segments that I alluded to, are they appropriate to the mission differentiation that we've assigned to them, or do they reflect a problem, a mismatch between spending, between resources and mission? Turning to the second topic, affordability. By some national measures, California is still doing relatively well on rates of borrowing and debt levels and financial aid keeping up with tuition increases. We are trending somewhat downward there. But this is another potentially surprising or counterintuitive piece of data, that the state performs poorly on the share of family income needed to pay for college, especially in the community colleges. That probably may surprise you because of the low tuition, but the next graph makes the point that tuition is a very, very small part of total college-going costs, particularly in the community colleges. So that's another stacked bar graph, and the bottom part of the graph is the living expenses. So they're almost the same across all three segments, UC, CSU, and community colleges. And then you can see that the tuition costs are a significant part of total costs for UC and CSU, and that has been very problematic because tuition has more than doubled in the last 10 years, although they're still below some of the public comparison institutions. But the community colleges, by keeping the policy to keep fees low and to waive fees for half or more students is not helping with the affordability problem because of the much, much larger cost of college going. We still have a very serious affordability problem in the community colleges. Turning to the last page, because tuition has increased so dramatically across the universities and the community colleges, the share of the total cost, if you think about how much the taxpayers are paying and how much students are paying, the share that students pay has really increased greatly over the last decade. And the shares, as I show in that little table there, vary by segment. And so here on this issue of affordability, what we don't know, or what we haven't really come to consensus about that would be helpful to think about, is what is a reasonable share or a fair share for students to pay. We kind of just drift into this situation because of the boom and bust cycle and increasing tuition to fill in for reduced revenues. And should that share vary by institution or by program or by type of degree? So turning to my last topic, efficiency. Efficiency is really problematic to assess and account for without a better understanding of quality. You know, we get in these kind of back and forth debates about if you reduce cost per student, are you more efficient or have you reduced quality? And you know, it is a sticky issue that we really don't have a good handle on. A useful measure of efficiency, keeping in mind that difficult issue of quality, is cost per degree. Cost per degree reflects a lot of factors underlying that, and so we are above national average in cost per degree at UC and the community colleges. We're below national average at the CSU. But we don't know a lot about efficiency that would be better if we knew more. And for example, what is the cost to produce a bachelor's degree in different routes? We just automatically assume that it's cheaper in the community colleges because we choose to allocate so much less money to the community colleges. But when you factor in attrition rates and different missions and all kinds of things, we don't really know what the cost is to produce one of these million bachelor's degrees that we need to produce. What is the most efficient way to get degrees and certificates in the regions and in the fields where we need them? So in conclusion, again, this public needs, public agenda approach is wonderful. I think it's the way to go, but it requires better information on costs per degree, cost per degree, if that's what we're trying to meet the goals of more degrees. We need better information on cost per degree. We need a better means to understand the relationship between what we spend and the quality so that efforts to meet goals for more degrees and certificates do not compromise the quality that we all strive for.
Thank you very much. Are there questions from members? Lots to think about. Just as a kind of, so has anybody done any research on what is quality education? Can you define that?
Well, I'm sure they have. I'm not the expert on that. You know, there's been the cost. There was I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, there was a cost, and the community colleges did a study on I forget what it was cost, real cost of education or something like that. So there is a lot of information out there, but we haven't brought it into our policymaking conversation.
And the other question is, cost per degree at UCs are above national average. But you're including both the BA degree and the professional degrees?
We don't break it down. I mean, that's one of the things that we really could stand to learn more about is what is the cost at both of our university systems for educating undergraduates. You know, we just see the whole budget, and particularly lower division students, because that's where we have to make these choices about how many students we're going to have go to the community colleges for lower division as opposed to the CSU or the university, but we don't have that underlying data to make those comparisons.
Okay, thanks. Okay, all right, thank you very much, ladies, thank you. And our final, no, it's the second for final.
Yeah, next we have lessons from other states. We have Martha Snyder, Senior Associate HCM Strategist, and Sarah Ansell, the Associate Commissioner for Policy and Legislation at the Indiana Commission for Higher Education. Please come forward. And we'll begin with Ms. Snyder.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and to address the issues that you have put on the table. I want to commend you for your persistence in pursuing this conversation and recognizing the need to create a strategic vision for the state of California's post-secondary attainment. I think a lot of the conversation that we've already heard has really established that a great foundation has been laid in California in terms of defining some generally broad priorities for the state, recognizing the need to have greater accountability and pursuing aligned finance policies in other areas. But I want to take a step back. I'm going to emphasize, first of all, given the work that we have done with other states, the need to push even further on the goals and the priorities that the state has established. We see a lot of states that are adopting important policies, such as finance policies and smarter pathways. But what we see as the foundation to the sustainability and the buy-in of these policies is a broad-reaching, clearly articulated state attainment goal and strategic vision or public agenda. We know that I kind of relate it to, as a runner, the need for a state attainment goal. You know, if I were to sign up for a race and have no idea what that distance was, and no idea when the date of that race is, I would be left without any indication of what my training plan should be, what pace or what my goal is for finishing that race in a certain time, and what my related pace needs to be. Similarly, without goals for post-secondary education, a state has no anchor against which to evaluate information and guide the development, implementation, and evaluation of all other budget, finance, and policy decisions. In our work with other states, we see key components of well-established goals are that they are quantifiable, challenging, and tied to a specific date. You received in the last panel a lot of great data about what some of those goals and more specific goals could be, what some of your priorities could be. But we also know that they need to address challenging and specific attainment gaps for underrepresented populations, as it is those populations whose increased success is absolutely necessary for any state to meet their attainment needs. The goal should also be based on an analysis of state workforce needs and embraced broadly by many stakeholders. Therefore, it should include the collaboration and input of stakeholders such as institutions, legislators, and other policymakers, and other outside organizations and businesses. Once states have developed a goal and related priorities, states can and should develop a statewide plan that articulates the related policy priorities and strategies necessary to reach state attainment needs and meet the public needs of the state. One important thing, which I know has been talked about briefly today, is finance policy. And no, money is not the only way to drive outcomes, but it certainly plays a role. And in our work with states, and I'll get into some state-specific examples, one of the consistent things across these states is that they have altered their finance and their investment in higher education to align with the new attainment needs of the state. Once again, there are also the issue of metrics. There's a lot of metrics that have been established through legislation here in California and provided by the institutions. But at the state level, metrics should be limited and clear and focused first and primarily on the disaggregated student progress and completion measures. Cost, time to degree, and all of those other things are essential as well. But again, if you're linking these metrics to the state attainment goal, it is essential that they be disaggregated and focused first and foremost on student progress and completion. We also need to create some sort of reporting and monitoring system. Again, I will get into it a little bit in terms of the challenges that I think face California in this particular regard, but it is very hard if you don't have some sort of centralized agency or coordinating board or commission to understand and evaluate those data and to inform policy and budget decisions. We have worked with states in the creation of these public agendas and related finance and other policies. I just want to talk a little bit about what some other states have done to address their public agenda and post-secondary attainment needs. I think one of the most talked about states nationally is Tennessee. Several years ago in 2010, they approached and developed a comprehensive piece of legislation that established increased educational attainment as the primary need for the state. They clearly articulated several attainment goals and identified the populations that were needed to reach those attainment goals. They also this piece of legislation directed the development of a 5-year public agenda that would guide all policy and budget decisions for the state moving forward. The development of this public agenda involved multiple and varied stakeholders. There was a public agenda steering committee established that included policymakers, system leaders, institution representatives, businesses, and other public stakeholders. Key aspects of the public agenda include, again, an articulated attainment goal, focus on improved efficiency as well as increased overall production, targeting of underserved populations, and priority of workforce needs in high-demand fields or underrepresented or undersupplied credentials. This public agenda, again, guides and reinforces several key policy levers that have since been adopted by the state. First and foremost, their outcomes funding policy, which completely replaces an enrollment-driven policy and ties it to important metrics of student progression outcomes. This model is mission differentiated, so it does not treat all institutions in the state the same. It recognizes that different metrics need to be applied for different institutions. But it does recognize that the state's finance policy will set the track for how institutions can respond. It also includes a state-level progress report that reports on key metrics toward overarching goals and metrics to monitor effectiveness. And it also emphasizes and reviews ongoing institution missions to promote intersector collaboration and recognize the need for regional diversity or diversity in certain regions across the state. Another state that we have worked extensively with is Ohio. Ohio, through its College Completion Task Force, which had, again, broad representation, including the Board of Regents, legislators and staff, public and private sector, institutional representatives, and business and community leaders, issued a report with recommendations for policies and priorities to increase the educational attainment of Ohio citizens. This included, again, aligned funding policies focused on student progress and completion and other mission-specific priorities, and the requirement for each campus to develop campus completion plans that articulate how each campus will achieve the goals and strategies necessary to increase student success. In Georgia, there was established, again, a council to articulate policies and strategies related to an identified goal of 60% attainment by 2020. This council evaluated the workforce requirements and established related completion goals by types, degrees, and credentials needed. System and campus level goals were then set and aligned based on needed participation and success from target populations. Each system reports their progress to the council, which includes, again, representatives from the governor's office, board chairs of each system, Georgia Department of Education, Georgia Student Finance Commission, and business and community leaders. This council then makes recommendations to policymakers that guide finance and policy, including, again, the establishment of an outcomes-based funding formula. I think these state examples, and we can provide you with much more detail on the process and the policies incorporated by each of these states, but I think they provide an important context and proof points for how you could approach a post-secondary attainment agenda. The circumstances obviously differ in each state, and California has unique challenges, and in is in of itself unique. But I do think that the challenges and approaches can provide important lessons and have lent to our understanding of some best practices for states to consider as they approach this important task. I think perhaps the biggest challenge facing California is the lack of a mechanism for broad collaboration and engagement across all stakeholders, and a clearly articulated attainment goal that can serve as the foundation for all public policy and finance decisions. We have seen states achieve this without a centralized governance structure, but I do think that is something to consider, is somehow finding a way for broad state collaboration. Pulling on the examples of the 3 states I just emphasized, we see that there is kind of a unique or a consistent pattern across those states. State-level policymakers have provided clear guidance and expectations for the what, the who, and the by when. The what being the need to develop a statewide attainment goal and related student success-focused post-secondary agenda, including finance policy. The who, again, establishing a process for a broad set of stakeholders that includes policymakers, institution leaders, and other stakeholders. And the by when, a clear deadline for when this agenda will be developed and an implementation plan to ensure it is not a paper-only plan. All of these states also recognize that data matter, and they focus on the data that matter. Some sort of coordinated or centralized process for collecting and analyzing data is necessary. Data are a powerful tool to measuring progress and evaluating the impact of various policy and programmatic changes. They also recognize that this is not a static, one-time conversation, but one that requires continued and ongoing input and refinement. And finally, they all align their finance model in whole or in part to the new state attainment needs and public policy agenda. I like to say you get what you pay for when it comes to finance policy. Again, I think California has many good building blocks in place. You have broadly established state post-secondary priorities and some related metrics and reporting requirements. I think you are posed to take the next step towards building a statewide attainment goal and statewide public agenda that can truly guide your public policy and finance decisions. I look forward to answering any questions you have, and again, I thank you for letting me be here.